Welcome to Data Brew by Databricks with Denny and Brooke. The series allows us to explore various topics in the data and AI community. And whether we're talking about data engineering or data science, we're going to interview subject matter experts to dive deeper into these topics. And while we're enjoying our morning brew. My name is Denny Lee. I'm a principal developer advocate here at Databricks and one half of Data Brew.
And hello, I'm Brooke Wenig, Director of our Machine Learning practice at Databricks and the other half of Data Brew. And today, I'm thrilled to introduce Pallavi Koppol, a research scientist at Databricks working on domain-specific intelligence and benchmarks for LLMs. Welcome, Pallavi.
Thanks for having me.
So I know there's a lot of talk about general intelligence and AGI, but why should people care about domain-specific intelligence?
Yeah, so you're right. I think recently, for a while now, I think, right, people have been evaluating LLMs on these like really general benchmarks and talking about this idea of like AGI or like general intelligence or like how well can models perform overall. Um, and what I like to say is that, like, imagine you meet like the smartest person in the world, and then you bring them onto your company. There's still gonna be like company specific, like trade secrets, like lingo, jargon, how you like to manipulate data, preferences, all those things that they're going to need to learn, even if they know like everything else in the world, right? Because that stuff is kind of proprietary. Um, and so that's where domain intelligence comes in. So you can have a really good model, but will it be good at the things you need it to do in your context?
And so how do we think about then benchmarking, like all of these benchmarks out there for very general intelligence, but trying to complete a sentence is not the same task as trying to generate SQL as a financial analyst. So how do we think about transitioning from general benchmarks to domain-specific benchmarks?
Yeah. So in general, like I think the best kind of benchmark is always like we always want a benchmark to be as close a proxy for like real world usage as possible. So definitely, for those customers or cases where you are able to just be like, hey, I have a log of interactions, it's not sensitive, and maybe I can just like replay on that and see how well my model performed there. That's kind of like I would say ideal by some standards, but obviously that's not always the case for like security reasons, sensitivity reasons, just not having enough data. So then we start to think about how can we create examples that are most reflective of the real world setting and how people are actually going to interact with these models or how systems are going to interact with them if people aren't going to be involved.
Got it. So I'm curious then. I mean, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. This idea that the academic benchmarks themselves don't are not representative of what customers are typically going to work with, and we all know that the benchmarks themselves are often, the models themselves are often designed specifically to make sure they do really well with those benchmarks. But then, can you describe a little bit more about what type of categories that we're typically dealing with when it comes to this idea of domain intelligence?
Yeah, so recently we've been looking at a few. There's the vast number, but the few that we looked at most in depth recently are things like RAG tasks, so like retrieval augmented generation. Those often have to do with like particular company corpora, right? Like documents specific to the company. Then like data extraction, so a lot of like text to JSON, text to YAML. Um, and then also a lot of like tool use, like function calling type stuff, where companies might have their own particular set of functions they want to use to achieve different tasks. So those are the ones that we've been looking at most closely. There's others that we're just not talking about quite yet. But
Could you dive a bit deeper into the Databricks Intelligence Benchmarking Suite? I know you and a number of other folks from Databricks recently published a blog about this, but for all of the listeners on the podcast, if you could dive a bit deeper into how exactly those three categories that you just described, the RAG, uh, the unstructured to structured text generation, as well as function or tool usage, come into play with DIBS.
yeah, for sure. So basically, DIBS or the Domain Intelligence Benchmarking Suite came about because we were doing a lot of like, training models, coming up with different model recipes for fine tuning, things that we, want to be useful to our customers. And we were using kind of just these like general academic benchmarks in large part. And we kind of sat down and we're like, hey, if we really want to be as useful to our customers as possible, we need to be developing against benchmarks that are reflective of what those customers care about. So we kind of went through and talked to several folks on the product side, customers, and figured out that three major areas that we could focus on and kind of get some movement in were exactly those three: the RAG, unstructured to structured, and the tool use. So the way we kind of went about doing that was we had some benchmarks, like there's some function calling benchmarks that we had already been using, um, and figuring out like how can we extend or modify these to be more analogous to what our customers are doing, right? So like really taking inspiration from like the use cases we were seeing and either modifying existing benchmarks, creating new ones from scratch where we didn't have things before. Um, yeah, just trying to be as rigorous as possible in that process.
Right, actually, that's perfect. So, can you like again, the what's great is that a lot of this is on the benchmarking domain intelligence blog that was published anyways. But for those that are listening to podcasts, can you provide some examples of what like things that you're modifying? For example, look, I'm just literally looking at the blog right now, which is like for BFCL full universe. There's a modification to that for function call, like for example.
Yes, yeah. So basically, the original BFCL and a lot of the function calling evals that were existing had much smaller, I would say, like function catalogs than we see our customers having. Sometimes our customers will come in and be like, I have like so many functions. And so then finding the right one becomes like a lot harder, right? Because there's like 10,000 in there. So it's easy to get lost. Uh, and that's not really reflected as well in the academic benchmarks. Also, because what we saw customers trying to do was be like, well, maybe I can just shove all of these functions into the model's context window and maybe that'll just solve my problem, right? And we were like, well, is that true? Like, let's find out what happens if we have a really large corpus of functions. And that's the approach we try to take. And it was actually really interesting, right? We find that, first of all, if you want to do that, at least at the time of publishing this blog post, your only bets would be to use the Gemini models because none of the other model providers have models with context windows large enough to support that larger set of functions. But also, even if you did want to do that, right, we found that using RAG is actually slightly better because it limits your function scope a little bit, reduces those distractors, makes it more likely you're going to be able to choose the correct function. So there's some interesting findings that you don't really get just by using the academic benchmarks that I think are relevant to our customers.
I mean, actually, just to follow up exactly what you just said about potentially thousands of functions. In for something like BFCL, I'm just curious, how many functions are people typically working with versus, sorry, for the academic benchmark versus like the type that you're typically seeing what customers actually use?
Yeah, so there's already a few different versions, but some will be like, oh, here's like 4 functions. Can you choose like the
Mm.
correct function from that subset of 4? Yeah.
So yeah, from tens to thousands versus four, slight difference. Got it. Okay, that's
Odds
fair. That's
definitely
fair.
not in your favor.
That's completely fair. And then, I'm just curious. So that's an example of you modifying an existing benchmark. That's cool. But then, what are some examples of benchmarks that you actually had to create from scratch? Then.
Yeah. So, for example, for the unstructured to structured use case, that's not really something that's well represented in the academic setting. Like, there's some variants that are like analogs, but not really anything of the task that we were seeing where someone's like, here's like a document or like paragraphs, and I just want, like, I have like a schema, like a JSON schema in this case, that I'm presenting, sometimes in a strictly structured format, sometimes just describing a natural language. And I want to, excuse me, extract like the relevant information into that schema. So that one we actually created from scratch. And by from scratch, what I mean is we partnered with like a data annotation company, like a data vendor, to kind of see like what types of content I guess we wanted. Like, and in this case, we said, hey, we want some like paragraphs, some like information, some schemas, and the results for those, and kind of working with them to procure a data set that is more aligned with what our customers are doing. And then on top of that, we're actually currently extending that to add in more domain specific things. So, for example, one place where we see a lot of this is in like legal contracts and stuff like that, where people are like, hey, there's the document itself is often quite structured, but I want to like further structure that somehow into a schema, right? Um, so we're like continuing to edit and grow this. But that's an example of how we, created one ourselves.
So, speaking of continuing to edit and grow, how much is enough? Like, I feel like you could go down a rabbit hole if you're making a benchmark that has millions of question answer pairs, for example. But just curious, what is a good sense for I have thoroughly benchmarked my solution?
This is a really good question. I think that the evals that we have range on the order of like The smallest one is probably like less than 100, and the largest is probably like a few hundred. They're not like these massive evals because we want them to be really specific to a few things. Um, I'm sure certain that there's room for those to grow, and I'm sure that they will grow as we have customers with like differing needs, and we're like, hey, this is something we should expand into. Um, but yeah, I think that once we get to like, you know, many thousands, it's like they're useful for different things, right? Like I would say that that gives a general sense of like overall, am I performing good enough? But it starts to lose that nuance of like, hey, here's like the specific ways in which I'm succeeding or failing. And I think something on our team that we've been trying to do a little bit more is really look at the data as well and be like, all right, um, are these examples representative of different types of use cases? Because if you have like many thousands of examples, but they're all overly similar, it's also unclear what you're getting from that in this particular domain intelligence context. So that's our current sense of it, but I think eval science is also a open field of exploration.
And so on that note, so we just talked a bit about trying to guard against like make sure we have a sufficient data, but then still trying to avoid overfitting. And so I'm just curious, how do you handle the case of data leakage? Of a model might have seen that example in its training data. How do you guard against that from the eval side?
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons that we cared strongly about having like a domain intelligence benchmark. So if you look at the RAG evals in particular, um, the academic ones have like you'll see that models score very high on these, and that's often because the data comes from Wikipedia style, entries. And so by this point, a lot of models have trained on that, so they're doing really well just because they like have by-hearted Wikipedia, right? So I think that some of the RAG data sets that we have or like the text-to-JSON where it's like these are kind of novel data sets in some sense because we either procured them specifically for the purpose of being distinct from what's already out there. Um, oh yeah, and things like that. So I'm hoping that that helps. Like these data sets, the data in these data sets are not being used for training in any capacity. They're kind of like kept separate. And I think as we continue to grow this, we're that's something that we're definitely keeping in mind as we decide what data should go into them. Yeah.
I'm curious then, is there like because we often talk about how the mass use of a synthetic data, right, to basically, grow these systems, help. Uh, is there an implication then, like maybe that if we are using synthetic data and using, for example, other large language models to help generate those more synthetic data, that we may in fact just be overfitting? Or I'm just curious from the is there an implication there, or am I still reading a little bit too much into this?
No, that's an interesting question. And I don't know that I have a definitive answer. I guess what I will say is that some tasks I think are more or less prone to this than others. So, for example, something like text to JSON or like this unstructured to structured task. I think that even if you memorized the contents, like what the evaluation is testing for is your ability to like synthesize it into a different structure. And so I feel like maybe it matters slightly less whether or not you memorize the originating passage there. Whereas in other things like knowledge retrieval type stuff, definitely, right? Like it could be like, oh, if there's yeah, if there's some sort of leakage or like learning or like because I'm using synthetic data, I'm like accidentally including things that maybe I already know, right? Um, so I could definitely see that there. But yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the ways we try to, and this is kind of like hand wavy as we figure out like how to do this in a rigorous way, right? Which is an active area of research, is like trying to like look also at the distribution of scores that the models are getting on these, right? Like if we start to see like, hey, a lot of models are getting really high scores. Either that means it's too easy because the task itself is too easy, or because they all already know how to do the task because they've like learned it, right? Um, so I think there's ways to kind of like gut check for it, but it's not an exact science.
So going back to the blog, uh, one of the takeaways it seems like is there is no single model that dominated every task. It's like there's certain models that were better at certain tasks relative to others. So just curious to get your perspective in terms of like What are your recommendations? There clearly wasn't one model that ruled them all magically on this. So what type of models would you recommend to customers when they're thinking about a specific task?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing I would say is that I don't really think that a person can go wrong really off the bat. Like a lot of these models that we're seeing now are quite capable, regardless of whether they're closed source, open source, etc. I think what we're seeing is that as these major model providers try to differentiate their models, right, they imbue them with kind of different characteristics. So the Gemini models that I mentioned earlier, right, really long context windows. If that seems like it is important for your task and is something that you want to take advantage of, probably worth considering, right? If you want something that is open source because you have some different constraints from your company or organization, or you want to mess around with the model a little bit more, maybe you should consider the Llama models, right? If you want something just out of the box, maybe consider the OpenAI or Claude models, or I guess Anthropic models, since I said OpenAI models. So, but basically, I think that my strongest recommendation is not, oh, use this particular model, but rather just take some time to really consider what are these model providers trying to provide in the offerings that they have, and how do those relate or not relate to the use case and the task that I have. Because if you do that little bit of digging, it might actually surprise you a little bit. Um,
And so when you're evaluating these different models on the benchmark site, I know some of them have slightly different nuances in the prompts, for example. How do you control for that as you swap out the models for these benchmarks?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So there's a lot of different, I guess there's two primary approaches to this. One approach is to be I'm going to tailor the prompt for each model to try to get as best performance as I could possibly get. And then the other approach is just to be we're going to fix the prompt, and however the models score, that's how they score, because that is our prompt. We chose the latter approach because we think it's just a little bit more sustainable. It's really hard to know that you have found the optimal prompt for a particular model. But we generally try to have a prompt where we think most of the models perform well on it. Sometimes in an initial version of a prompt for an eval, we'll see, hey, this model is always formatting something incorrectly. And usually we'll add that into the prompt and be more clear about, hey, we want this very strict formatting, just to kind of smooth out those edges there. But other than that, it's kind of one size fits all, and this is how the models perform on this task. We view that as part of the task spec, is how I would say.
Got it. Well, then one thing I'm curious about is then is there an implication then for sake of argument, as we are starting go into the world of agents, right? Where then it's a task that's actually multiple tasks, right? That you would then potentially have based on these domain intelligence benchmarking, potentially different models from different sources, providers, excuse me, that are being applied for the different agents that you're actually running.
Yeah, for sure. I think that I personally don't think there's any need to be oh, we only have one model doing all the tasks. I think that, as we've been talking about, different models have different strengths. I think orchestrating between them, figuring out which model to use for which task, that's something that's highly relevant. We've done a little bit of research into this already, actually, and we'll probably continue to explore agents as a space. And I think that multiple types of worker models or agent models here is definitely on the table.
Cool. And then one quick follow up. Could you sort of describe, from a high level at least, the differences that you found between, in general, from a high level, the closed source models versus the open source models that you had done in terms of your evaluation here?
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, I guess the most obvious difference, on the surface at least, is that you can get open source models in very small sizes and do whatever you want with those, right? We don't we haven't really talked too much about the tiny models, the 1B, 3Bs, but they do exist. And they have certainly their uses. I think that in terms of performance, we see that the gap is narrowing quite a lot. The largest llama models are pretty good. Yeah, I think in the blog we have a figure showing that they're approaching 4.0 quality. Um and yeah, I think sometimes there might be particular tasks that they're slightly better at. Their profile, I would say, is slightly different. So for example, the llama model is particularly good at function calling. Unclear why, maybe they just trained a lot for that. Um but overall I would say they're with the 405B is within probably plus or minus a few percentage points on a lot of major tasks, and the 70B is pretty much similar in performance. We only evaluated the llama models as far as like the open source models go, but yeah. So I was pretty impressed to see just the general state of things. It's an exciting time. Yeah.
Oh, it's definitely an exciting time. Um, and a lot of our customers, I've noticed, they might have some hard constraints of like spend cannot exceed 500K a month. Latency has to be less than 10 seconds for a time to completion, for example. But within those constraints, it's kind of a free for all of they don't have a particular bias towards one model or another, as long as it's the highest quality that meets those constraints. And so I'm curious, are there any benchmarks that really incorporate those trade-offs of quality and cost and latency all into one so you can make the most informed decision of like 7 dB might be the best for this use case, but actually if you're more latency and cost concerned, maybe you switch to an AP, but you know you're going to be compromising on quality.
Yeah, this is a really good question and something that we've actively talked about, like internally. The benchmarks that we, talk about in the blog post don't actually directly deal with cost and latency concerns, but internally we have a similar set, mostly the same set of benchmarks, and we do kind of like latency profiling on them, cost profiling on them. So as we continue to like grow and expand this, that's definitely something we're considering about whether or not to include that into DIBS, because we know that's definitely something our customers care a lot about. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want that curve of like picking that like elbow part of the curve.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the things that I'd love to understand better is then, eh, okay, so you've talked about how in some cases you're building your own like benchmarks. Can you describe a little bit about like what were the issues coming around to building some of them? And I'm presuming some of the main issues are basically finding procuring high quality data to begin with. So I
Yeah.
just want to go back to that part a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I do think that the hardest part is figuring out what samples you care about for evaluation, right? Like, so what is the distribution of problems that you care about? How many of each problem do you want? Like, when you're working with like a data vendor, making sure that they understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish and like how you can, um, and how they can deliver the data that you need there. And then, so for some of this, we like had already like we already so once we already had the data, right? Taking like when you get it from a data vendor, right, you're basically just going to get like, here's the question and here's like the gold standard answer. And like, how do you actually turn that into an eval set, right? Like, how do I, if I'm doing text to JSON, how do I come up with like a single number that captures, is the structure of the schema correct? Is the content in the schema correct when it's not like direct string matching, right? It's like you can summarize in multiple ways that are all correct. How do you actually make this into something that is like sensible, that can be like, um, measured? That was pretty challenging too.
And in terms of composing that data set, like I'm curious, do you take like a Pareto principle approach of like you want 80% of the examples to be kind of like table stakes easy and then 20% to be hard? Do you want them all to be difficult? Just curious how you think about challenging versus almost like table stakes questions that you always wanted to answer correctly.
Yeah. So I think that this is a good question. I think we tried to, so for some of them we were just procuring the data, right? Like I'm pretty sure I didn't do the data procurement myself, so I'm kind of speaking to my understanding of it. But my understanding is that it was just kind of like, you know, you are people as well. Like, how do you think people would use this or do this? Um, and taking a kind of an iterative approach with annotators, right? As opposed to being super prescriptive about it. So that's kind of one approach. For places where we're modifying things, I think um, that's where we pushed more on like, let's make this harder. Let's make this more challenging. Because we kind of treated it like, hey, the academic version exists and is more like table stakes at this point. So now we're really trying to push this into like, if we go up a level of complexity, how are the models performing? But I think that getting that spread and that distribution is definitely, it's kind of like a design choice, right? And it's yeah.
So following up on that, I mean, also then it tells me a little bit about. I mean, it makes me want to ask the questions about the domain itself. Then, right? So, for example, if you look at the categories that you have, right? For example, you for finance, you did SEC filings for Petronas. For the docs QA, data set that you have that's answering all questions right off the Databricks documentation. I'm just curious then, do you see, whether it's DIBS or just in general of benchmarking, do you see more and more domain specific benchmarks being generated, like, for media and arts, or advertising, or whatever? What other of these, like, common industry use cases? Do you feel that that's something that, Databricks should be doing, or the company itself, other data providers themselves should be doing for this type of exact scenario?
Yeah, I think this is a place where companies like Databricks are really well positioned to help out because I think for any individual company, right, like they may not have the diversity of use cases to warrant spending the investment really on creating this type of suite, right? And then for folks in academia, like they may not just have like the visibility to understanding what all of these different types of companies are doing in order to create something broader. So I think that companies like Databricks are in a really privileged position to be able to be really valuable and say like, hey, we see this is what people are really doing. We see these are common pain points or places where people want to improve, and we have the bandwidth to actually help people do that by investing research into it, and coming up with benchmarks like this because I don't really see them coming as rigorously, I would say, or as like maybe rigorous isn't the right word because there's really good evals coming out there, but like as tailored perhaps, um, to different enterprise tasks.
And so, as enterprises think about creating benchmarks, per, should they do this before they try to build any form of Gen AI application? Should they expect to do a subset up front and then it will evolve throughout the development? Just curious, should this be more of a test-driven development or should this be more of an afterthought?
Yeah. Ideally, my bias is towards saying that ideally it would be great to have your benchmark ahead of time. I think in practice, that very rarely happens. Um, just that's just what we see. But I think I would view it less as like test. I guess it is driven development in that sense. But the reason I think that benchmarks should come first is because I think you can view your benchmark or your evaluation as like a product spec in some sense, right? Because it's really making concrete what you want to succeed at, like
Hmm.
what you want your model or application to be able to do. And so like having that like clear vision early on is just going to make it easier to get to that finish line. At the same time, I think one of the reasons this is challenging is because the field is growing and changing so fast that sometimes we don't really know, is this possible? Is this like too greenfield, like too exploratory? And I think that kind of leads to some tension where people are like, I'm just going to try to build it and then see how I'm doing after I've built it. Um, but as much as possible, having a clearer sense of ideally, this is what I'd like to achieve, that just helps in general.
Yeah, we found customers starting off with a very small benchmark. And then when they start to see their performance, they're like, oh my goodness, it'd be great if we expanded to support these 10 other use cases that we didn't think about. So totally get where you're coming from. Like the product spec just continues to evolve.
Yes.
Therefore, the benchmark continues. And so I know we talked a lot about more of the academic benchmarks. We're talking about more domain specific enterprise benchmarks. What opportunities do you see for better collaboration between the two?
Yeah, I this is something I would really hope to see. I think that there's a lot of room because I don't feel like as much has been done. And I think this is for a few reasons, right? Like academics do amazing work and are typically much more like data and compute constrained than companies are. Companies are much less data and compute constrained, but often have less bandwidth to do like really exploratory research. And so I think what ends up happening is that we get some like we tend to find more of those like general intelligence benchmarks coming from academia because there's just more general content out there in the world that they can use. So I'd love to see like more partnerships. I think like, interns obviously are a great way to do this. And I think there's a lot of interns out there, PhD interns and others who have been doing exactly this type of work. But I do think that one place where it could be really interesting is so I often find like some interesting papers from academics where they have I don't know how to talk about it, but I guess it's like almost like a task specific type of benchmark. So it'll be like, hey, like here's how in theory I would do like I think Sweetbench is a good example of this, right? Where it's like a GitHub commits and it's like fixing like it's a very agentic task on like for software development And it's like similar but distinct to like how companies might do things internally with their very large code bases. Obviously, you can't directly share company code just with everybody, but like finding some way to be like, hey, maybe we'll like trial out similar things or like have subsets or like here's some like modifications. Um, yeah. In general, I think maybe if there were more like slightly shared like open source contributions that people could make, kind of sharing more of their perspective from that side, possibly. But sorry, just thinking as I'm talking. But it's definitely something I'd like to see more of because right now it feels like that's a bridge that is not quite connected, and there's a lot of potential on either side because if you're too constrained, right, you're not going to be as creative as you can be, and I think that's happening a little bit on both sides here.
Okay, so this is gonna naturally lead me to ask the question: how can we get more involved with these evaluations then? Because it seems like we're doing some really cool work here, but then naturally, when this goes out, the blog's gone out, people are gonna naturally ask, "How can I get involved?"
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we want people to be asking that question. We definitely want to grow this. I would consider it like a V0, V1 type thing right now. If you are if you're a professional or a student who likes being in the eval space or thinking about these problems, definitely, consider reaching out to join our team or work with us. If you're a company or someone who works with Databricks and you feel like you have a use case that you think, other people probably also have, or is that really interesting and important and unrepresented and difficult to measure, then definitely you can contact your AE and we'd love to find a way to see if it makes sense to expand DIBS to include those things.
Awesome. Thank you so much again for joining us today, Pallavi. An enlightening conversation on the importance of domain intelligence shifting away from general intelligence and just how important evals are to building quality Gen AI applications.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me. It was great chatting.
Yeah.